Yeah, as Kenneth mentioned, I first came across CoreCon while I was working on my PhD on students learning in economics, which I used a threshold concepts framing for that study. And both CoreCon and the threshold concepts framework have become increasingly influential in the last few years. Although they set out to do different things, we could narrowly say the one is a curriculum, the other is a theory of learning. We could also see them both as orientations in teaching undergraduate economics. So I found it quite surprising that they don't seem to explicitly speak to each other in any of the literature that I've looked at. But listening to what's come out of the discussion today, there are obviously huge areas of complementarity, and also, I was going to say possible tensions, but maybe it's more like possible areas where we need to pay a bit more attention or slightly closer attention in how we implement and adapt CoreCon. So my approach will be firstly just to introduce the idea of threshold concepts briefly, why it's got a bearing on teaching with CoreCon, to describe the view of learning that the TC framework sees, how it sees learning generally, and to draw out some implications for what and how we teach, so pedagogy and curriculum. I'm going to be drawing mainly on existing theoretical and empirical work within the threshold concepts framework, but I will augment it with some of my own findings from an in-depth qualitative study of students' learning that was conducted in a threshold concepts-oriented tutorial program that ran alongside mainstream intermediate micro-module at UKZN. And I hope that those of you who've worked extensively with CORE already will elaborate on some of the initial apparent complementarities and areas where we need to pay closer attention as those emerge, or perhaps in the discussion. Okay, so to start with the threshold concepts framework and the view of learning that is inherent in the framework, it emerged from a UK-wide study on teaching and learning environments, but specifically from the economic strand of that project. So Mayer and Land 2003 was the seminal paper on threshold concepts. The theory has since grown. It's now known as the threshold concepts framework, which really represents a view of learning. It draws together ideas from a range of educational theories and other disciplines into a very coherent, holistic view of learning that accounts for individual social and emotional contexts. It's evolved rapidly over the last few years. It's become well established in thinking about teaching and learning in higher education in a range of different disciplines and contexts. So from accounting to zoology to high schools to doctoral studies, professional practice, and to becoming a student in itself. It's not, the URL reference there is to Prof. Flanagan's website, which is really a repository of just about everything academic written on threshold concepts. That's a very useful resource. Currently lists over 1,700 references from a number of countries, mostly still the UK, Australasia, and the States, but over 50 countries, including South Africa, have had studies drawing on the TC framework implemented in some form or another. Threshold concepts theory sees learning as transformative and multidimensional, can't be separated from the individual learner or their individual context. It specifically addresses sources of difficulty or trouble in learning, but it's not a testable hypothesis or a proposed solution. It's not prescriptive, it's rather a sensitizing concept or a way in which we can see learning with certain implications that sort of emerge from it. And for that reason, it might be particularly worth looking at here because it's a way of understanding disciplinary learning that has some implications for what we teach and for how we teach it. It offers a holistic view of learning that brings in affective and contextual considerations, and that might be especially important in a context like ours, where we have university entrants coming from very diverse backgrounds, highly unequal backgrounds, particularly in terms of schooling history and access to resources. So viewing a possible shift to CoreCon through a threshold concepts perspective might be helpful. So that's the rationale for looking at it together or looking at CoreCon through a threshold concepts lens. To start with the basic idea, just to begin with Mayer and Land's seminal definition of threshold concepts, that really distills the premise on which this view of learning is based. And they put forward this view that in probably all disciplines, there are certain ideas that act as portals or as gateways to progression in disciplinary ways of thinking. They open up a new, previously inaccessible way of thinking about something, and related to that often a transformed view of the world, a transformed understanding. But until students grasp that concept and master that concept and move on, they remain stuck. They can't progress in disciplinary ways of thinking. Once the idea has been mastered. So as a result of comprehending the threshold concept, there might be a transformed internal view of the subject matter, a transformed view of the world more broadly and of reality, and perhaps even a changed view of themselves, a shift in their own identity. Okay, so often it brings a changed perspective of the world, and also more fundamentally an identity shift, a shift in their sense of themselves, which we'll see can be quite an emotional experience for learners, hence the affective aspects of learning that the theory also accommodates. So what kinds of ideas might we consider threshold concepts? They might be formal disciplinary ideas, which is probably what's going to be of most interest to us here. And I'll list some possible candidates in a minute. There might be everyday concepts as well, or there might be abstractions, images, or metaphors. They're not exactly the same as basic or core or key concepts, although threshold concepts might be those as well. Their distinguishing feature is really that they are transformative. So they change the way the learner sees something. They change the way you make sense of a phenomenon, a real-world phenomenon. They also are the potential blockages, the stuck places, the areas where learners experience trouble, get stuck, but once they've mastered them, they're able to proceed in disciplinary ways of thinking and see problems in new ways. So together, they also represent how learners think in a discipline. What does it actually mean to think or speak or practice like an economist or a lawyer or a historian or a nurse, a mathematician, whatever discipline you like? Ultimately, together, crossing those conceptual thresholds brings disciplinary ways of knowing, and not only that, but also ways of thinking and practicing that can transform your sense of yourself or bring about an identity shift. The next slide shows a selection of possible disciplinary threshold concepts from a range of different disciplines. And hopefully that'll illustrate the idea that threshold concepts are really provisional, contestable, and subjective. So what is threshold for one learner might not be threshold for someone else. They really exist where the discipline intersects with the individual learner. So they're not givens that are fundamental to a discipline. They really emerge in interaction between the learner and the discipline. So if we look at opportunity cost, for example, taking one that's close to home, it's fundamental to economic analysis. For some students, comprehending that is transformative. It changes the way they look at events in the world at large and possibly even in their own lives. But for other students, they will say, I've always thought that way. They won't experience it as transformative. So what's threshold for one might not be threshold to another. And if you look at the other likely candidates from different disciplines on that slide, then hopefully that will become clear as well. So for many of those, they will be experienced as transformative. They might initially be troublesome or counterintuitive or somehow ideas that students struggle with. Coming to learn them fully might mean letting go of your prior understandings or reworking prior understandings. And they also often define disciplinary ways of thinking. So that takes us to some of the features of a threshold concept, which I'll look at in a minute. But before that, the next slide shows some economics concepts, neoclassical economics concepts, a selection of them suggested by Davies and Mangan, who've done a lot of work in economics threshold concept theory. And again, that should bring home the idea that threshold concepts are situated and contested. Even in this selection, which was arrived at, by the way, in discussion with a range of academics, these were identified as likely candidates. But they still weren't, there wasn't full consensus that these are the threshold concepts in economics. For some they will be, for others they won't. And obviously, this is particular to a particular approach of curriculum and of the way economics is taught. So thinking back to the slide that Sam put up earlier with the concepts taking a core approach, the threshold concepts would probably be a slightly different combination to what we're looking at here. So they aren't a given list that's somehow, decreed from above somewhere. Also important is that they are interconnected, so they form, in Davies and Mangan's initial words, sort of a web of understanding. So taken together, they are integrated, they affect each other. Coming to understand one might change how you understand other of those concepts. And more recently, Davies has referred to them as interlocking subframes within a learner's overall framework or sort of mental map by which you make sense of the world. But whether you see them as a web or as interconnecting subframes, they are interconnected either way. So how do we know it is actually a threshold concept? How do we identify a concept as threshold? Maryland identified some likely features. Firstly, threshold concepts likely to be, two of those jump up, transformative. In other words, it will entail a shift in how you view the subject matter and a shift in how you view the world at large, maybe even a shift in yourself. So it's ontological as well as the straightforward getting of the concept, the conceptual shift. Also irreversible in that once that concept has been understood, you can't unsee it. It's very unlikely that you will lose that understanding. Integrative in that mastering the concept also reveals interconnections with other parts of the discipline. Bounded and serving to define disciplinary borders. And potentially, possibly inherently troublesome, so involving some kind of knowledge that learners often find troublesome because it might be alien or counterintuitive. It might involve troublesome language, drawing on Perkins's theory of troublesome knowledge. So for some reason, it often involves knowledge that learners will struggle with at work and at first. Later work has added 2 additional features. Crossing a conceptual threshold is likely to be discursive, in that it involves an extended use of disciplinary language, so learning the discourse of economics, for instance, and also reconstitutive, because it means letting go of your prior understandings and reworking them in line with the disciplinary understandings of the new concept. So reworking the mental models by which you make sense of the world. And the authors deliberately made that not a checklist. They introduced those qualifiers. So it's likely features. It's possibly, potentially, inherently, maybe. It's not a definite checklist. And later work has said the only non-negotiable defining feature is that they must be transformative in the way the learner sees things. The others may or may not apply. So from that, it should be clear we're not going to come to a perfect consensus of what particular threshold concepts might be. And that is also perhaps important, just to take note of the variability in how different learners will experience different concepts, particularly, again, in our very diverse context here. Okay, so the next slide summarizes quite a lot. I don't want to spend too much time on that because it does summarize the whole threshold concept view of learning. But essentially, it would begin with the learner's encounter with this new troublesome knowledge, the threshold concept, the existentially unfamiliar content, but which is also educationally critical. That precipitates an entry into liminality, which is a phase of learning. You can see it's central to the whole model. And that, the term liminality comes from the Roman limen for threshold. It's a state of being between, so between not knowing or not having understood and coming to fully understand the concept. It's like a rite of passage. As you come to understand the concept, learners may go back and forth. They may oscillate between the old understanding and the new, authentic understanding that they're working towards. It can also be a highly emotional state. To zoom in on that a little more closely, on liminality, it's a very unsettled space. There may be these backwards and forwards takes. It's strongly emotional because the emotional and the cognitive or conceptual learning aspects are intertwined. And learners are going to vary in how they approach that liminal phase, that sort of uncertain, emotionally challenging phase as you're getting to grips with the concept, as it maybe comes into view and then recedes again. Their own meta-learning is important. That is their sense of awareness of and control over their own learning. And also their inner resources, their own resilience, optimism, their sense of self-efficacy and capability and so on, are also important in getting them through that challenging liminal phase of learning. To draw a little bit on my findings, because just saying all this emotional stuff to economists, well, it might be a little surprising. It was surprising to me in my own research, and where students in a focus group brainstormed some responses and organized them into themes about their learning. The theme which had the most responses was feelings, and that took me by surprise. The feelings that they described were, on the downside, anxiety, self-doubt, frustration, despair. A lot of that linked to assessment and also linked to the lecture delivery, which ties into some of the things that came up in discussion earlier on about making students feel stupid, maybe in a slightly different context. But the lecture delivery seemed to reinforce this idea that they were there to receive this truth, this body of knowledge, as rapidly as they could, and then be able to reproduce it. And that was a source of pressure and also a feeling of lack of self-efficacy as a result of being under that kind of pressure, by contrast to the peer group-based learning that we did in the tutorial groups. On the positive side, they also noted joy and relief and a sense of self-efficacy and growing capability as they began to master disciplinary ideas. Also, there were emotions around the discipline content itself. So, coming to understand opportunity cost, a lot of them described sadness. A surprising number described the sadness of coming to terms with that idea. Some of them also mentioned a clash with their own personal values. So, some cognitive dissonance. They said, I can't think like that, my feelings get in the way, between their own values and this sort of neoclassical homo economicus self-interest idea. So that sort of discomfort was interesting. Their responses to that unknown, to that liminal emotional phase, would be like any response to the unknown. They might choose to fight and stay on and persist, or they might choose to flee or freeze. If they persist and learn, the outcome is that the threshold is crossed, they experience that understanding as transformative and integrative and so on. If they flee or freeze, they could remain stuck, they could fail or withdraw, literally or figuratively, project the blame elsewhere, and just not emerge to that full disciplinary understanding. So their own inner effective psychological resources had a big impact on how they would make that liminal crossing. So I thought I was going to be looking at cognitive conceptual development, but it turned out to be much, much broader than I had anticipated. And that's in terms of what the theory had expected, although it was a bit of a surprise to me. Okay, so threshold concepts-oriented research, including mine, shows that learning in any discipline is strongly effective. It's a transformative process. It involves far more than simply acquiring the disciplinary concepts and being able to replicate the disciplinary techniques. So what are the implications then for curriculum and pedagogy? And that's obviously a very wide question, but it might be helpful to think about it in terms of three main contributions that the threshold concepts framework makes. The one is the focus on disciplinary ideas, which is a lot of what we've been talking about here. The second is that idea of liminality and all its associated complexities and challenges. And then thirdly, the interactions between knowing and being, so the sort of identity-related implications, the personal transformation that happens as a result of learning. If we take those one by one, firstly, literally reviewing discipline and curriculum, that is really what we are doing, I suppose, with core econ more broadly. So how can the threshold concepts perspective perhaps add some value and guide us there? We could start by asking, what are the important ideas? And obviously a lot of this is already happening. I haven't worked with core directly or taught with it, but it's been amazing to see what's been coming out from people who already have. So what are the important ideas, the stuck places, the troublesome transformative points? What does mastery really entail? I'll refer to those as the jewels in the curriculum, and say we should pay particular attention to how we teach them, how we sequence them, how much time we allow for them, bearing in mind that learning can be recursive. It can involve going backwards and forwards and requiring several takes on a concept for understanding to come into view. And a number of my students describe that as well. So elasticity, for example. I think I get it and then I don't, and then it sort of comes into view again and then I lose it, and then eventually mastering it and integrating it properly. Related to that as well is the idea that less may be more. So we should avoid a congested curriculum, maybe take a narrower initial focus, and this very much ties in with the idea of spreading it over a couple of years, being very selective about the units that we look at. And particularly in our context with the challenges of high proportions of underprepared students, a narrower initial engagement might allow for more meaningful engagement with a wider range of issues later on. The idea of troublesome knowledge also prompts us to ask, are there any rules of the discipline that we are not making explicit enough? Modeling was a classic example there. So is it possible that we are not making it clear enough, the rules of economic modeling, the rationale behind certain constructs like elasticity? And those are things that we tend to take for granted in second year. They are first year ideas, but we find that students get to second year without having fully grasped those. And that also means, of course, that our assessment at the end of first year is off. But that's probably a different story, or a related story. But those implicit rules we should try to make more explicit. Also, are there implicit rules of studenthood or of academic engagement at university level that are perhaps not made clear enough to our students? So the theory draws attention to preliminal variation, which is something that, like we had a question, I'm not sure if the student is still here, but about that pre-knowledge. I can't remember who said that. Was it you? Yes. That pre-knowledge. The preliminal variation is simply how do students differ in terms of what they come in with. And that might be things like the mathematical background. It might be language. Many students come in with English as a second or third language. It might be general literacies, awareness of financial and economic transactions through their own lived experience. It might be awareness of contemporary culture and current events. There's going to be variation in that, and being sensitive to that will obviously inform our teaching as well. So, the second broad area is the idea of teaching for liminal learning. So how might we rethink, to borrow your phrase, rethink teaching as well for liminal learning? I've looked at 4 main areas there. Again, these are many things that have come up in the discussion already. So the idea of engagement, engaging students, that depends largely on, well, not entirely, but a teacher's influence there is through their pedagogical content knowledge, which is really the intersection of your discipline knowledge with your knowledge for teaching. So you know as a teacher where the difficult areas are, where the stuck places are, and how best to put those across. How do we develop that further? How can we design teaching strategies to bring about those transformed understandings? Can we maybe make opportunities for students to confront the very things that are troublesome, the troublesome aspects of the discipline? The lecture delivery is another one here. So we still rely very heavily on lecture delivery. Coricon lends itself to doing that less so, to a flipped classroom approach and being complementary with active and perhaps collaborative learning approaches, which students find much more empowering and makes for much more effective engagement as well. So that is an area that I think we must keep exploring. In terms of variation in students' learning, we need to, I think Liesl used the phrase listen. Listen for understanding, because students vary in how they reach understanding, as well as in terms of what they come in with. So we need to listen for understanding, because it's very difficult for us to gaze back over those thresholds that we crossed a long time ago. So listen to see where our students are at. Also to think about whether our assessment really measures that understanding and that mastery. And the preliminal variation we've already spoken about. 2 additional areas. The one I'd refer to as meta-learning thresholds. So before they even get to mastering the economics concepts, what are the thresholds in terms of their approaches to learning? So their views of learning, what is knowledge? Are we, by lecturing, reinforcing this idea that knowledge is this body of truth that you must absorb and then reproduce? How do we help our students move from reproduction towards construction of genuine understanding? Particularly where learner biography involves a history of poor schooling. How do we create opportunities for students to unlearn those traditional approaches, those historical approaches they've been using to learning and to knowledge? In terms of integration, how do we encourage integration of the new concepts and reworking of their understanding? Can we find opportunities for them to connect up their learning? And I think we've heard lots of examples of how Coricon does that. Even if you look at the way it's laid out, the linkages through the themes and the topics, the explicit linkages that are made, that could help with integrating that knowledge, drawing those links between topics. Other ways of doing it might be problem-based learning, also obviously not mutually exclusive, but quite complementary. Letting undergrads do research, doing economics, literally. Getting them to keep reflective journals, which I don't think we've heard about, but that is making a space for them to reflect on what they've learned and how it applies to their own lives. The third broad area is then how can teachers support their students through the transformations that learning brings. So in that emotionally exacting liminal transition, which might be even more emotionally exacting where students are making the transition to university study from particularly a poor schooling background, those emotional demands might be even more taxing. How do we support students in making those shifts? How can we create supportive teaching and learning environments? It's a very broad question with lots of intangibles. It's not, obviously not only or primarily about curriculum necessarily, but 2 things we could highlight as far as the teacher's role goes would be to help students develop their metacognitive skills, particularly to tolerate the uncertainty and the anxiety en route to understanding. So to accept that not knowing is part of coming to know. Don't expect that you're going to get the whole thing entirely the first time around. So that also goes with the idea of constructing your knowledge and knowing that it's not this body of dispensed truth you just have to get the first time around. accept that anxiety is normal. A lot of my students said, many of them in individual interviews, said how they felt inferior to the rest of the group. And actually the ones who most often reflected that feeling were those who were some of the strongest students in their group. But there was a sort of endemic self-doubt and anxiety that might be linked to schooling history and the view of learning and knowledge and the pressures that they found themselves under. And then we can also help them to develop a sense of their place in the discipline as they master those disciplinary ways of thinking, practicing, and doing. And obviously, core econ, doing economics is a direct way of developing that disciplinary identity. The peer group-based approach was also very effective in helping with that. So you had a group of, one student described it as a forum of economists in the making, working together on peer group-based tasks. Peer group discussion really helped to develop their sense of capability as capable learners in the discipline. And that's obviously a source of affective support as well as the cognitive support. In addition to those three areas of intervention, I also want to highlight two cross-cutting themes that don't come straight out of the Threshold Concepts framework, but came out of my own work, because I think they seem to speak directly to core econ, or core speaks directly to them. The first one is the idea of students' learning goal orientation and how it links to the discipline as they experience it. So the learning goal orientation, the learning goals, one of the themes that came out from my findings, and it was the one that showed the most variation across students. At the one extreme, we had students who described mastery goals, saying, I need to know why. I want to know why the theory is what it is. I want to understand better how the world works. The others had performance goal orientation and just said, I need to pass this module. It's a compulsory credit. I want to get on with my degree. A lot of our students become accounting students for whom 2 years of economics is core. It's compulsory for the course. But the split wasn't exactly along those lines. There were a lot of non-majors who were not going to major in economics, but still had mastery goals and wanted to understand the underlying reasoning. But those taking a mastery goal orientation tended to also take deep approaches to learning, focused on constructing understanding rather than rote learning or just memorizing mechanical problem-solving ways of approaching it. And that learning goal orientation, in turn, seemed to hinge closely on the discipline as students experienced it. So did they experience it as meaningful, relevant, and congruent with their own identities, their own aspirations for themselves, or their own values? And if they experienced the discipline as meaningful and identity congruent, they were more likely to form mastery goals. And the discipline as they experienced it, it's a shorthand really for saying it's the content, the curriculum, plus the pedagogical approach, plus the assessment methods. If that resonated or aligned with their sense of themselves, they tended to engage much more directly and have deeper mastery goals and a deeper approach to learning. So obviously the question for us is, how can the discipline as experienced be made more meaningful and relevant to all our students? And that's partly what a lot of you have been answering today already. In addition to that, things like creating space for reflection, real-world examples, obviously, applying economics in your own lives. The final slide is the second sort of cross-cutting theme, closely related, because the discipline as students experience it ties very closely to issues of affect or their emotional responses to what they learn and how they learn, their values and their identity. So they really are very closely tied. How can we account for or even try to harness some of those emotional responses and students' values in what and how we teach, particularly in this context, or contexts, if you like, because as someone pointed out earlier, our universities are not all the same context either in South Africa. So, as I said just now, some students in my study alluded to a clash between their personal altruistic values and the neoclassical self-interest values. And we might say, okay, Homo economicus is just a useful approximation. It's not a normative rule to live by. But then again, who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. And as Barnett puts it, identity is formed in part by the standards embedded in the discipline. So, taking a little bit further, that leads us to bigger questions about the changes we want to bring about in our students as citizens. Should we be looking at affective and ethical proficiencies as well as the conceptual proficiencies that we see the most being written about? At minimum, we should be allowing for complexity and ambiguity, acknowledging it and allowing debate in the way we teach. So, in addition to what we've been talking about today. Some examples from the literature would be using emotion and empathy as pedagogical tools, using them in the teaching, trying to introduce alternative ethical theories to the neoclassical, using big think questions, philosophical, moral and political philosophy questions. And at best, that usually only comes in the third year and beyond. Bringing those changes into first and second year, I think, would go a long way to making the discipline as students experience it more relevant, more meaningful to them. Okay, so by way of summary, just some questions to consider. Because of the pivotal role of students' goal orientation or their goal construals, and how that in turn depends on how the discipline as they experience it aligns with their sense of themselves, our work as teachers of economics, we could see it as being elevated from mainly conveying discipline content to trying to illuminate the relevance of that content and enhancing its meaning for students. So we need to look critically at what we teach and how we teach it, think about whether it is appropriately selected and structured to support conceptual threshold concepts. We need to provide space for students to reflect on that disciplinary learning and also on how it relates to them personally. And in order to do that, we need to pay attention to who our students are and what is important to them, what matters to them. And that should in turn inform our choices regarding content and teaching approaches that help them to see themselves as capable learners, and teaching and learning environments that they experience as supportive. So that's been a very brief introduction, but I hope it's shown that a threshold concepts lens can add some value, point us towards ways in which we might re-examine those three areas in university teaching. CoreEcon obviously has a lot to offer in terms of curriculum, and perhaps overlaying or seeing it through a threshold concepts lens might help us in selecting and structuring it in our concepts, in our context, But equally, we need to consider our pedagogy and ensure that our teaching and learning approaches are supportive, or creating supportive teaching and learning environments as well. And then as a final point, any meaningful change in the curriculum and in the way we teach is likely to involve some big transformation on the part of teachers as well. So it probably represents quite a significant threshold or liminal process for those of us changing the way we teach. It's changing our conceptions of knowledge, of learning, of teaching. And that, of course, could come with attendant troublesomeness for us and the pull of the familiar conspiring against making any changes. So we also need to think about enabling measures that might facilitate and support academics in trying to make those shifts. Okay, I will leave it there for now, and hope to hear more from those of you who've already engaged more directly with CoreEcon curriculum. Thank you.